Hey guys, tonight we drift into velvet shadows and lantern-lit streets, where secrets slip between silk folds and power changes hands on the backs of camels, and under the covers of forbidden lovers. You're not reading a romance novel. You're standing in the center of Chang'an, the Tang Dynasty's heartbeat, where perfumes imported from Arabia mingle with the scent of sesame oil frying in the alleyways, and the air thrums with low flutes, laughter, and soft silk dragging across polished stone. But here's your gentle warning. If you thought the silk roads were just about trading fabrics, buckle in. You're about to be emotionally mugged by a 1,000-year-old love triangle involving a poet, a courtesan, and enough economic influence to tilt a dynasty. You probably won't survive this one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into a quiet tea pavilion just outside the main Chang'an market, where the silk merchants have closed their stalls and the only deals being struck now are whispered behind paper screens. The women here don't just serve tea, they recite poetry, sing like mist rising off a river, and, if you're rich and charming enough, they just might rewrite a trade agreement for you between verses. One of the most famous is Zhu Doa, courtesan, poet, and political influencer centuries before influencer became a dirty word. Her lovers included bureaucrats, merchants, and one particularly smitten tax collector who, rumor has it, altered tariffs for her imported fans. No, not fans like subscribers, actual silk and bamboo fans imported from Korea. The trade routes bent around her preferences. Historians still argue whether these women were cultural hostesses or covert power brokers. But what's clear is that the brocade-robed lovers who passed through their chambers often left with more than a hangover and poetry scribbled on parchment. They carried new loyalties, fresh alliances, and sometimes even detailed maps tucked into sleeves or whispered between kisses. It wasn't just Chang'an's brothels that pulsed with intrigue. The city itself was designed like a checkerboard of sensual traps and bureaucratic gates. If the emperor's court was the brain of the Tang world, these tea houses were its hormonal limbic system, sending impulses, lusts, and commerce rippling down the trade routes all the way to Byzantium. Speaking of Byzantium, remember that name. You'll hear it again later, when some bored Venetian decides to turn Silk Road gossip into marketing. But right now, you're watching silkworms boil in copper pots, their tiny lives given up for robes that drape over the thighs of lovers discussing tariffs and poetry. It's a sensual world, but one with sharp teeth. A single misstep, one affair exposed. One jealous rival with a scroll of blackmail and fortunes vanished like fog on the Li River. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Did you know Chang'an courtesans were trained to cry on command? Not for your pity, of course, but to perform heartbreak like a weapon. A well-timed tear at a poetry recital could win sympathy, favor, or even deflect suspicion when an affair turned political. One city magistrate fell so hard for a courtesan's dramatics that he offered her a silk contract meant for his brother-in-law. That brother-in-law, incidentally, retaliated by sleeping with the emperor's favorite flute teacher. Chang'an's elite were basically running a highly caffeinated soap opera on horseback. And yes, sex with kings was more than pillow talk. Eleanor Herman reminds us in her book that royal intimacy was transactional. The body was currency. In China, royal lovers weren't always about romance. They were strategic placements. A favored bedmate could get her family a lucrative shipping contract, or a new silk dye monopoly. In one scroll, there's reference to a woman known only as Spring Lotus, whose pillow-side whispers convinced a Tang prince to shift his caravan's route southward, away from raiders and into safer but more expensive territory. That one decision rerouted profits for years, benefiting her brother's textile guild, And still, some historians argue whether these tales were real or exaggerated, whether pillow influence truly shaped logistics or whether it's just what old scholars like to gossip about when their own love lives got stale. But look closely, and the economic ripple effects are stitched right into the robes we find in tombs. Patterns that shouldn't be there, colors sourced from territories not yet officially traded with. Someone made a deal, and someone else whispered it in the dark dot as you slip back out into the market. You see an old merchant packing up bolts of pale pink silk dyed with sapanwood, imported all the way from Southeast Asia. You wonder who requested that color, a noblewoman, a courtesan, or maybe a trader's lover, hoping to wrap herself in something that reminded him of his last visit to Chang'an. Maybe she even asked him to come back. Maybe she promised him poetry. Or maybe, more likely, she promised him exclusive access to the newest dye recipe in exchange for just one night. You follow the camel bells west, past the crumbling watchtowers and apricot-laced winds of the Gansu corridor, where the Silk Road tightens into a desert bottleneck and the whispers of Chang'an fade beneath the rustle of caravan silk. You've entered Persia now, a land of wine-colored evenings and courtyards where lovers speak through poetry because the truth, when said too plainly, can get your head lopped off. Here, in the Sassanid twilight and early Islamic dawn, the art of loving was not just personal, it was diplomatic, tactical, and sometimes traded like saffron in discreet ceramic jars. You enter one such garden, vines curling around moonlit lattice where a noblewoman reclines on cushions, weaving perfume into her hair with fingers like scandal. Her name? A Nahid, daughter of a mid-ranking administrator and a woman of impossible charm, who wrote love notes laced with metaphors about spice caravans and date palms, then tucked them into her suitor's saddlebags alongside, yes, actual trade maps. Historians still argue whether Anahid's influence was overstated by later poets looking to sell steamy epics, but trade records do show that shortly after her most famous affair with a merchant from Samarkand, a new tax was levied on lapis lazuli exports, conveniently benefiting her uncle's mine. Coincidence? Maybe. But in Persia, seduction wasn't just a bedroom art, it was an economic lever. Dressed in poetry and passed down in whispers by day, the bazaars brim with henna honey and stolen Byzantine glass. By night, the palaces and private gardens become negotiation chambers soaked in rosewater and stringed instruments. You imagine a merchant, a bit tipsy on pomegranate wine, offering a love poem instead of a bribe to an official's daughter. The lines are clumsy, but she laughs anyway because she knows the price of cinnamon from India just dropped, and this flirtation might be worth entertaining. That's how affairs bloomed here, under perfumed arches to the hum of insects and ambition. You pass through Isfahan, Shiraz, and Nishapur, where even the mathematicians flirt in couplets and philosophers compose erotic riddles too smart to be censored. Sex, as Foucault reminded us, is never just about pleasure, it's about discourse, structure, hierarchy. And nowhere was that more true than here, where one well-placed affair could tilt a caravan route hundreds of miles. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In one remote Persian town, a woman known only as the Collector ran a private salon for visiting traders. And now, slowly, the candles burn lower. The walls no longer whisper. The room exhales. The queen is gone, but her bedroom remains not just in wood and stone, but in memory. A gilded witness to how desire, expectation, and politics can all be folded into a single pillowcase. End of script. Sweet dreams. HSHED, invite them to dinner, pour endless wine, and ask peculiar questions like, if your camel broke a leg in the Dashti Kavir, which alternate route would you take? Most thought her eccentric, but later, some of her questions appeared in anonymous reports to tax collectors and local governors. Some suspect she was a proto-spy, gathering intelligence through pillow talk. Others argue she was just really good at gossip. Either way, her little salon saw more trade policy shapeshifting than some official embassies. Meanwhile, in the shadows of court life, eunuchs passed secret letters between princesses and poets, many of whom never saw each other, but carried on years-long affairs through scented calligraphy. These exchanges weren't just about longing. They discussed dowries, marriage proposals, and yes, caravan permits. In one documented case, a noble concubine convinced her lover to smuggle Chinese silk disguised as Armenian wool. The plot unraveled only when a shipment was discovered to weigh too little silk. For all its luxury, doesn't have the heft of good Armenian fleece. The man was exiled. The woman? She vanished into a northern estate, her letters quietly preserved in a clay jar beneath the floorboards, rediscovered only centuries later. And then there's the case of the merchant prince Ardashir, whose many lovers included both men and women across the trade corridor. One of them, a Sogdian translator named Karima, is believed to have introduced him to a lucrative jade source in what's now Kyrgyzstan. Their affair was brief, intense, and according to Peter Webb, immortalized in a line of erotic verse that describes green stone resting against warm thigh. Historians still argue whether the jade deal would have happened anyway, but the records do show Ardashir's fortune tripled after his time with Karima. And when she disappeared mysteriously, some say assassinated, others say she faked her death and joined a monastery. Ardashir spent 10 years writing ghazals he refused to publish. Heartbreak, apparently, isn't tax-deductible. As you watch the moon rise over the Persian desert, you realize the Silk Roads weren't just shaped by maps, horses, or kings, but by the soft fingers of women like Anahid, the whispered riddles of lovers like Karima, and the careful power plays of noblewomen who understood that a sweet poem could sometimes reroute more silver than 100 armed guards. Even now, as the wind shifts through the ruins of old caravanserais, it still carries traces of rosewater and regret. You wake up somewhere in the vast blank spaces between Persian cities, where the sun doesn't rise so much as it glares at you, and the wind smells like camel sweat, dry leather, and the distant memory of apricots. This is Central Asia, where the Silk Road becomes less of a highway and more of a mirage stretching endlessly through the steppes and deserts that connect worlds. But hidden among these brutal sands and mountain passes are women who don't belong in any polite empire's history book. You meet one just outside the city of Merv, dressed in a robe stitched with coins that tinkle when she moves. Her name is Tumara, and she doesn't seduce for love or coin, she seduces for borders. Tumara is a Tatar noblewoman by birth and a smuggler by choice. Her lovers include rival warlords, visiting diplomats, and once, allegedly, a monk disguised as a merchant. She trades more than silks. She deals in secrets, salt routes, and tax loopholes. Historians still argue whether Tumara was truly a queen, as some epics claim, or just an unusually successful trader with a knack for pillow talk and poison. What's less debated is the impact she left, a sudden shift in camel tariffs through her homeland, right after she began a rumored affair with a Chinese emissary. By the time you reach the edge of the Karakum Desert, you realize that love here doesn't look like roses and poetry. It looks like scratchy wool blankets, smoky fires, and tense negotiations over fermented mare's milk. You watch a man approach a yurt under cover of night, carrying a pouch of saffron and a bundle of scrolls. The woman who emerges is tall, draped in layers of red and gold, with eyes like unfinished business. She's a chieftain's daughter, and she's got 4 husbands, each stationed in a different caravanserai. But tonight, she's meeting her lover, a Kushan spice merchant, who needs safe passage for his goods, and he's willing to offer a year's profit to sleep on her furs and whisper trade routes in her ear. They don't speak the same language, but desire, as always, doesn't need subtitles. And here's your fringe fact to keep you entertained while they negotiate with glances. One tribe in this region used embroidered pillowcases as a form of Secret communication. Each stitch signified a phrase, a kind of tactile language passed between lovers who couldn't afford to be seen speaking openly. One particularly well-preserved example reads, when translated, "Tell your cousin to stop overcharging me for salt." Romantic, right? Another, slightly more poetic, says, "The road is dust, but your name cools my tongue." It's practically a haiku. These embroidered messages were often mistaken by outsiders as simple decoration, but scholars now believe they were central to how women passed information without raising suspicion. Whether these codes influenced actual trade deals is still up for debate, but considering how many of them include names, dates, and caravan symbols, it's unlikely they were just pretty pillows. Sex here wasn't just a physical act, it was a kind of contract. The Kama Sutra, while mostly associated with India, had influence here too, through the intellectual spillover of Gupta culture. In its original form, it's not a manual for contortion, it's a philosophical exploration of desire, social status, and strategy. One passage describes how a courtesan can elevate her position, not by beauty alone, but by timing her affections to coincide with her lover's rising fortune. It's disturbingly business savvy, and perfectly suited to life on the Silk Road, where love, commerce, and survival are braided into the same fraying rope. You pass a caravan halted for the night, where a storyteller is recounting the tale of a woman named Dildora, who seduced a Mongol tax collector, only to rob him blind and flee into the mountains with both his ledger and his boots. Whether Dildora existed or not, her legend persists because it fits the pattern. Women on this road weren't just passive beauties, they were operators, information brokers, risk analysts in embroidered veils. One historian argues that these Central Asian women formed an informal network passing messages, facilitating deals, and sometimes derailing entire convoys through carefully timed betrayals. Others dismiss this as speculative. But then again, so much of this history is speculative, whispered, half-buried, sung in lullabies passed down through women who couldn't write their names but remembered every tax collector who ever underestimated. Then as the stars settle over the horizon and the desert temperature drops like a stone, you huddle near a fire and think about how many of these love stories were lost tucked into graves, burned in court scandals, or simply never written down. But they shaped the silk that reached Rome, the spices that flavored Byzantine feasts, and the pearls sewn into Venetian bridal gowns. Every soft whisper behind a curtain, every stolen kiss in a yurt, every embroidered pillowcase was part of a hidden economy, one not found in ledgers, but stitched into the bodies and memories of those who moved between borders like ghosts in silk robes. You think you've seen scandal, but then you land in Alexandria by way of a dusty Hellenistic port in Bactria, where an olive-skinned merchant with too much perfume and not enough discretion is loudly complaining about his fifth wife. "The last one stole my best carpets," he mutters to a tavern keeper, who just nods. Everyone here knows about Andreas of Rhodes. He's not a villain, he's just overcommitted. In his wake are weeping widows, suspicious customs officers, and a trail of velvet that somehow always ends in a new contract signed under a silk-sheeted roof. You watch him load his caravan. Dyes from India, incense from Arabia, and a few bolts of a mysterious indigo cotton that may or may not be legal to export. He's charming, no doubt, but what keeps his business booming isn't charm, it's the strategically placed wives stationed from Tyre to Taxila. Each one manages a depot, oversees trade, and in more than one case, intercepts competitors' shipments with a smile and a forged invoice. Historians still argue whether Andreas pioneered this system or merely perfected it, but there's no denying that love, or at least its logistical cousin, lust, was the engine of his entire trade empire. You walk through the market and overhear one of Andrea's ex-wives, Delia, negotiating loudly with a gemstone dealer. She's wearing a necklace that allegedly belonged to a Seleucid princess, though the dealer quietly suspects it came from Andrea's last mistress. Delia doesn't care. She's not bitter, she's rich. After their divorce, she took over the spice route between Herat and Ekbatana, and now her name is whispered with the same reverence traders usually reserved for deities or tax audits. Her secret? She still reads Andrea's letters, intercepts half of them through her couriers, and uses them to price gouge his customers before he even arrives. That, friends, is romantic vengeance at an administrative level. Meanwhile, you stumble across a carved stele in a ruined port city, depicting a man and a woman sharing a wine cup under a fig tree. Archaeologists say it was a common motif for wedding altars, but one fragment of accompanying text seems to suggest otherwise. To the one who marked my maps and unmarked my heart, it reads, "No one knows who wrote it, but it might be one of the earliest examples of what we'd now call long-distance trade-assisted emotional damage." And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some Hellenistic ports used marriage tokens to formalize romantic partnerships between merchants and local women during trade seasons. These weren't legally binding marriages, they were, let's say, highly negotiable leases. The women often ran taverns, bathhouses, or textile shops, and the tokens gave them access to imported goods, information, and protection during their temporary union. When the season ended, the merchant sailed on, and the token expired. Like yesterday's bread. But every now and then, a token holder refused to let go. One famously furious woman in Antioch is said to have cursed a merchant's entire spice shipment. According to Peter Webb, the man's cargo was mysteriously infested with weevils before reaching port. Coincidence? Probably. Or maybe not. Love can be a vengeful customs agent. You hear echoes of the Kama Sutra in these tales too, not the positions, but the strategies. There's a passage about managing multiple lovers discreetly, ensuring that each one feels uniquely chosen, while also maximizing personal gain. Andreas would have underlined it in red ink. His entire route was a soft power masterpiece. One night he might be offering roses to a high-ranking official's wife in Palmyra. The next he's slipping rare Mycenaean trinkets to a bored noblewoman in Persepolis, along with suggestions for tariff adjustments. And it works. For decades, his caravans avoid major bandit zones, his taxes remain suspiciously low, and every port seems to welcome him with open arms and open beds. Still, scholars debate whether his empire collapsed because of a failed marriage or a political misstep. There's a scroll badly singed, probably part of a confiscated customs report, that claims his last lover was also the mistress of a Parthian prince. That's fine, until it isn't. One whispered lie, one jealousy-fueled betrayal, and suddenly, Andrea's camels are impounded, his goods seized, and his carefully stitched network of affection and favors begins to unravel. Delia, watching from afar, is said to have toasted his downfall with pomegranate wine, and then raised tariffs by 12% on his former route. As the dust settles over these ruined cities and half-buried romances, you start to see the pattern. Men who thought they were running empires, only to realize too late that they were pawns in someone else's love letter. The Silk Road wasn't just traveled on foot or by hoof. It was moved by glances, by secrets muttered over spiced wine, and by people like Andreas and Delia, who understood that the fastest way to control a market was to make someone fall in love just long enough to forget the fine print. You descend into India now, where the air turns thick with jasmine and sandalwood, and the heat feels like a silk shawl pressed permanently against your skin. The bazaars here are symphonies of color and noise, gold bangles clinking, mango sellers arguing, philosophers debating beside prostitutes, and every other wall seems to echo with poetry. But if you follow the incense trail into the quiet heart of a royal city during the Gupta Empire, you'll find a chamber where the Kama Sutra isn't just read, it's practiced like diplomacy. You sit among plush cushions, peacock feathers swaying overhead, and across from you, a woman leans over a scroll. She's not a dancer, not a wife. She's a courtesan scholar, trained in music, chess, and yes, seduction, but also in trade arithmetic and courtly sabotage. Her name is Kalavati, and her reputation precedes her across 3 provinces and 2 languages. She once turned a simple flirtation with a regional governor into an exclusive gemstone import license. No small feat. The sapphires arrived polished. The contract arrived unsigned, but her name was already printed on the margins. Historians still argue whether women like Kalavati were truly empowered or simply decorated tools of male empires. But open any page of the Kama Sutra and you'll see something startling. Strategy. The book isn't a bedroom how-to, it's a survival manual, especially for women in courtly roles. There are chapters on how to assess a lover's honesty based on his gift-giving habits. Others explain how to use poetry to negotiate, or how to delay intimacy without losing favor tactics that sound suspiciously like modern business strategy. In Asari, Kalavati had mastered them all. One evening, she hosted a Persian merchant at a private recital. He came for music, stayed for the betel nut wine, and left with a sudden urge to reroute his cinnamon shipments through her brother's port. Coincidence? No. She'd played the vina in a scale known to make men feel nostalgic and homesick, subtly priming him to crave loyalty. You walk past temple walls carved with dancers and gods in acrobatic embraces, not vulgar, but oddly matter-of-fact, as though the divine had no interest in modesty. In this world, sex is spiritual, sensory, and sacred sometimes all at once. Erotic art is part of worship, and desire isn't shameful. It's a form of cosmic alignment. In one temple, a relief shows a couple mid-embrace beside a stack of ledgers. It's not a joke. The woman was a trader's wife, known for her ability to sweet-talk tax collectors. When her husband died, she kept the trade license by entertaining 3 regional governors in the same month. One later became a monk, another retired to poetry, the third, well, he promoted her son to chief customs clerk. And here's your offbeat fact tonight. During the Gupta period, a class of female agents known as Vishaya Neodika allegedly operated between kingdoms as courtesan diplomats. Their job? Escort traders safely, smooth over border conflicts, and if necessary, seduce rivals into compliance. There's a grainy manuscript describing one such woman, Padmavati, who neutralized an entire tax rebellion by hosting a week-long poetry contest. The winners received sandalwood oil and veiled kisses. The losers were too flattered to keep fighting. Meanwhile, you pass under banyan trees into darker alleys where love and trade intersect less gracefully. In some corners, women are sold along with bolts of fabric. Elsewhere, women sell themselves in exchange for fabric only to spin it into fortune. One such woman, Savita, began her life in a textile brothel near Varanasi, offering affection by the hour and advice by the ounce. She learned to predict floods by studying river traders' gossip and eventually began investing her earnings in boat shares. She was never officially literate, but by her death, she owned controlling interest in 3 guilds. Her most scandalous affair was with a giant tax official who abstained from nearly everything except her. They say he once smuggled her a blueprint for a new irrigation system tucked inside a hollowed-out mango dot as you settle into the shade. Watching parrots squabble in the distance, you begin to understand that the Silk Road was not one road. A web of braid of bodies and cargo, affection and ambition, ritual and routine. And in India, that braid was perfumed with cloves and soaked in metaphor. Love wasn't a side effect of trade. It was the lubricant that kept the whole machinery running. One sigh at the right moment, one song played with trembling fingers, could shift the movement of jade, pearls, or sandalwood more effectively than any decree from a palace. Kalavati, somewhere deep in her private chamber, probably smiles at that thought. She's pouring rose water into a shallow dish, preparing for a visit from a Turkish horse merchant who's convinced she loves only him. She doesn't. But she does love horses. And she really needs a new saddle. The wind shifts again, and with it, your path curls north along the ancient Buddhist trail that once shimmered with prayer wheels, incense ash, and the soft footfalls of wandering monks. But don't get too comfortable with the image of serene silence and celibate wisdom. You arrive at a mountaintop monastery where the walls may be painted with lotus flowers, but behind them, human hearts still beat, and not always according to the rules. Here, desire walks quietly in socks, slipping through cracks in doctrine, with the grace of someone who knows they're being watched. You sip barley tea beside a traveling scholar who once transcribed sutras for food and now transcribes gossip for gold. He tells you about Tenzin, a young monk famed not for his piety, but for his suspiciously accurate knowledge of caravan schedules and his habit of disappearing into nearby villages for hours at a time. One such village housed a girl named Dolma, whose job was officially to sell yak butter and unofficially to destroy vows of chastity with a smile and a shared apricot. Historians still argue whether monks like Tenzin were anomalies or whether the strict codes of celibacy were simply impossible to enforce across hundreds of miles of windblown terrain. Some records from the Dunhuang caves fragile, fox-nibbled scrolls suggest that several monastic outposts also functioned as rest stops for couriers, complete with comfort, confession, and discreet company. It wasn't written in bold ink, but the implication is clear. These were not temples of isolation, but hubs of influence where information, prayer, and passion all traded hands. And sometimes, monks themselves became couriers of a very different kind, carrying not just scriptures but smuggled silk, disguised in hollow scroll tubes. One particularly daring story tells of Chang'an, a senior monk who fell deeply in love with a Kashmiri herbalist passing through on pilgrimage. She taught him how to treat foot rot with honey and how to make a sleeping draught from river moss. He taught her how to write her name in Sanskrit. For 3 seasons, she returned with traders, and each time, she brought a new set of rare seeds for the monastery's garden. But eventually, one of the junior monks caught them exchanging letters hidden in prayer flags. Chang'an was demoted. The herbalist disappeared. Yet the garden she started still grows an awkward little oasis of saffron and shame. And here's your curious tidbit for tonight. In some Buddhist texts, there's a quiet acknowledgement of spiritual companionship that doesn't explicitly prohibit affection, but urges moderation. One obscure commentary even describes a warm heart discipline, which permits moments of emotional intimacy as long as attachment does not arise. You imagine that rule being tested at midnight under starlight, when even the most disciplined monk might mistake longing for enlightenment. Farther along the trail, in a monastery funded by merchants from Samarkand, there's a mural that scholars often misinterpret. It shows a monk, eyes closed, holding hands with a veiled figure whose gender is deliberately ambiguous. Some argue it's symbolic Buddha's compassion embodied. Others claim it's a portrait of a scandal, quietly honored by a grateful disciple, who was never caught. That same mural, by the way, is located in a hall built with funds mysteriously donated by a foreign widow, who never visited the site, but sent letters and regular gifts of silk thread. Silk that, upon later analysis, turned out to be dyed with pigments not available anywhere in her supposed region. Theories swirl. A secret affair? A disguised exile? A nun in hiding? Historians still debate. What they don't argue is the mural's power. It's the most visited spot in the entire complex, and the monks there light extra lamps for it at night, as if someone might return. Back on the trade routes, traders learn quickly which monasteries offer more than prayers. A whisper here, a coin there, and you're invited to a private garden where the moonlight turns heads fuzzy and sutras are swapped for song. One Persian trader's diary records such an encounter, noting with obvious restraint, the monk served tea. The tea was not the most interesting thing served. He goes on to describe the monk's curiosity about Babylonian astronomy, which may or may not be a euphemism. Either way, the monk later escorted the traitor to a safe pass through the Kode. Mountains 1, not listed on any map. Sex, Foucault reminds us, doesn't vanish under repression. It adapts, it camouflages. On this trail of robes and relics, desire is not stamped out, it is folded into ritual, swaddled in metaphor, and whispered through the echo of chanting halls. It hides in the curl of a painted lotus, in the careful way someone pours tea, in the offering of a blanket on a cold night. It's a vow broken not by loud rebellion, but by soft consent. As the stars press closer, and the chill creeps back into your bones, you pull your cloak tighter and glance behind. You. Was that a monk, or a lover pretending to be one? Either way, you walk a little faster, careful not to crush the tiny saffron flowers growing at the trail's edge, seeds of a story someone risked everything to plant. The heat hits you like a velvet slap as you descend into Baghdad at the height of its golden age, a city built like a riddle, where everything is geometry, perfume, and intrigue. Minarets glint under the sun, date palms sway with theatrical indifference, and somewhere in the shadows of the caliph's palace, someone is falling in love very, very stupidly. You walk past the spice merchants near the Tigris, the ones who always seem to be mid-argument, and slip into a tiled garden, where jasmine coils like smoke and the air itself tastes of rosewater and cinnamon. It's here, beneath latticework dripping with moonlight, that a young poet named Marwan is reciting lines not for the caliph or the court, but for a woman who shouldn't even be here. She's dressed in a silk robe stitched with verses from Sappho, smuggled from a Greek merchant who clearly understood marketing. Her name is Yasmina, and officially, she is a concubine of a vizier. Unofficially, she's running a private network of information brokers who pass through the city disguised as date sellers and flute players. Their affair isn't whispered, it's sung. Marwan releases poems like smoke signals, elegant, heart-wrecking. Metaphors that sound like longing but are actually coded messages. The gazelle wanders from oasis to oasis, seeking the pool where her reflection returns. Romantic, yes. But if you know which pool he means, you also know which caravanserai has the latest arrival of Syrian myrrh. Historians still argue whether Marwan's verses were love poems or low-key merchant memos. But the record shows that within months of their rumored tryst, a major shift in perfume trade routes occurred, diverting traffic through Yasmina's cousin's port in Basra. Love, in Baghdad, was less about flowers and more about clever accounting. You find yourself wandering through the city's house of wisdom, where scholars debate planetary orbits while scribes copy erotic poetry on the backs of algebra worksheets. Sex here is not just tolerated, it's intellectualized. The philosopher-poet Abu Nuwas writes openly about forbidden loves, both male and female, and is somehow both revered and scandalized in equal measure. His verse is sharp, funny, often drunk, and just subtle enough to be deniable. But there's one poem, just one, that mentions a silken letter slipped into the folds of a robe, carried by a merchant from Samara, and addressed to someone known only as the Fig-Hearted. Some believe this letter contained instructions for a trade alliance disguised as verse. Others think it was just about figs. Either way, the poem was copied and recopied, and eventually ended up on a scrap of silk used to wrap a Persian mirror, now resting quietly in a museum case, labeled Textile Fragment of Unknown Origin. Here's your fringe curiosity of the night. Within the Abbasid court, it's said that courtesans were trained in multiple disciplines, including astronomy, pharmacology, and espionage. One, named Layla al-Firuz, was known for her unmatched beauty and her ability to calculate the distance between Baghdad and Kashgar using only shadows and a bowl of water. She seduced a trader from Khwarezm and convinced him to reveal the new toll prices for his route. That information, tucked inside a love poem shaped like a flower, was then sold to rival merchants at a salon she hosted weekly. It wasn't just pillow talk. It was market leverage. And just when you think Baghdad has no more secrets, you're introduced to the bathhouses where the air is thick with steam and conversation. Beneath all the scrubbing and gossip, alliances are formed, and once, in one particularly lavish hammam, a love affair led to a trade war. A wealthy merchant fell for the son of a rival family and lavished him with gifts, pearls, silk robes, even a ship. When the relationship soured, so did the port access, and suddenly two cities were fighting over who got to dock where. The caliph intervened only after a rare manuscript was threatened with destruction. The affair itself was erased from official records, but a tapestry found in a private home years later showed two men sitting side by side, their hands almost, but not quite touching. Foucault would call it the hidden circuitry of desire. The way power flows quietly beneath the surface of intimacy. In Abbasid Baghdad, sex and strategy were indistinguishable. You couldn't love someone without altering the trade winds just a little, and love in turn was rarely aimless. A well-placed sigh, a delayed glance, a poem left casually on a scroll shelf. These were negotiations with rhythm. Yasmina, still sipping mint tea beneath the shade of a fig tree, understood this better than anyone. She once said, "A kiss is a transaction. The terms are always changing." No one knew if she was joking. No one asked her to explain. As you leave the city, the scent of sandalwood clings to your robes, and the sound of a distant zither trails behind you like an unfinished story. Baghdad doesn't say goodbye, it just keeps whispering. You expect Venice to smell like the sea, but it smells like melted wax, damp velvet, and secrets cooked slowly in olive oil. You've made it to the other end of the Silk Roads, but don't relax just yet. Here, beneath the glow of lanterns bobbing on canals and under the surveillance of stone lions with bored eyes, a new kind of love story waits. One stitched not with silk, but with fantasy. You step into a merchant salon where maps sprawl like gossip across the walls, and a servant pours wine laced with honey and rose hips. Your host? Matteo, a silver-haired trader who once sailed to Aleppo and came back with more than bolts of brocade. He returned with stories, the kind that make women blush and men reach for their wallets. In Venice, exotic isn't just a word, it's a weapon. And Matteo's greatest cargo isn't physical. It's the carefully curated image of distant lands dripping in sensuality and danger. He's not selling silk. He's selling lust with a shipping label. Tonight's client is a Venetian widow with scandal clinging to her like perfume. She wants rare perfumes and a Persian carpet, but more than that, she wants the story. Matteo leans in and begins. "In Samarkand," he whispers, "they weave their carpets by the moonlight, and the women who dye the threads sing to them." None of that is verified. But it doesn't matter. The widow sighs, writes a generous check, and later tells her friends that her new rug sings when you walk across it barefoot. Historians still argue whether Venetian traders deliberately embellished Silk Road tailies to boost prices, or whether they were genuinely enchanted. But it's clear these stories weren't random. They were strategically erotic, designed to make the East seem like one long, slow seduction. A sensuous whisper across empire lines. You walk through this spice market, where merchants talk about nutmeg like it's an aphrodisiac and cinnamon, as if it once seduced a pope. One young assistant brags about his cousin who married an Armenian silkworm breeder and now controls 3 caravans. You pause at a stall where a woman in pearl earrings is selling perfumes with names like Desert Rain and the Whisper of Kabul. She offers you a sample ambergris and musk, aged in rumor. You don't ask what's in it. You already know. Longing, filtered through marketing. And here's your offbeat fact of the night. Venetian perfume shops in the 14th century often came with back rooms where discreet consultations took place. Officially, these were for mixing custom scents. Unofficially, they were for exchanging letters, gossip, and, in more than one documented case, smuggled silk tucked inside hollowed-out prayer books. One scandalous episode involved a Florentine widow who received a coded love letter from a Persian poet. The letter was perfumed with saffron and hidden beneath a layer of lavender wax in a cosmetic jar. It arrived during Lent. She read it 3 times and then married a Genoese banker instead. But she kept the jar. This was the golden age of the souvenir affair. Merchants returning from their long voyages brought more than goods. They brought scandal. A comb carved by a Chinese artisan, gifted to a lover in Padua. A bolt of embroidered silk, sent anonymously to a nun who was rumored to have had a brief but fiery romance with a visiting Mamluk scribe. Every item carried a trace of someone's breath, someone's touch. And the further it traveled, the more deliciously distorted the story became. The erotic spirit, as Peter Webb once noted, isn't just about the body, it's about suggestion. Venice turned that suggestion into an art form. You visit a print shop where woodblock artists are illustrating Marco Polo's tailies with increasingly improbable curves and increasingly fewer clothes. The men buying these books aren't scholars. They're dreamers, collectors of fantasies sold at premium rates. One chapter is rumored to describe a queen in a desert city who never speaks, only writes her desires on parchment and sets them afloat down a river to be found by passing traders. Total fiction. But somewhere, someone is trying to locate that river. And then there's Lisabetta, a real woman whose diaries were found behind a loose brick in her villa. She'd had affairs with 3 traders, all from different ports, and used her time with each to compile a handwritten book of trade secrets. It's elegantly illustrated, with drawings of spices, camels, and the occasional naked man in a compromising position with a shipping manifest. Some of her advice includes, never trust a man who packs his own pepper, and the longer the voyage, the more lies in the story. Use both. The book is now in a private collection. Only fragments remain, but one passage still gets quoted. My lovers were all merchants. I trusted them only when they forgot they were lying. Foucault would raise an eyebrow at all of this and say, of course, Venice was obsessed with the erotic. It was a city of performance, where masks were mandatory and secrets were currency. Love wasn't real unless it was also a little bit dangerous. And trade wasn't profitable unless it came wrapped in lace, poetry, or scandal. So when you walk along the canals tonight and see lanterns flickering in upper windows, don't assume it's just a merchant counting coins. Sometimes it's someone reading an old letter, still perfumed, still unopened, still waiting. You think you've seen empires seduced, but nothing prepares you for the Mongols. Not the armor, not the thunder of hooves, and definitely not the unexpected tenderness folded beneath their reputation for carnage. The Mongol Empire wasn't built on brute force alone. It was stitched together with marriages, whispered alliances, and a surprising number of love letters delivered between yurts at dawn. You ride into Karakoram under a pale sky, the smell of Mare's milk and horse sweat thick in the air, and find that beneath the rugged exterior, the Mongol court is a buzzing hive of strategy, flirtation, and silk-draped diplomacy. Genghis Khan, for all his conquest, understood this. He married his daughters to rival rulers not just to secure loyalty, but to watch them rule in his name. One daughter, Alakai Beki, wielded more power than most generals, negotiating silk imports and tax exemptions, while occasionally sending gifts of fermented yogurt to her father. Some scholars claim these women were simply pawns. Others insist they were architects of empire, their bedrooms doubling as war rooms. You step into the gear of a high-ranking noblewoman, thick felt walls muffling the wind. Her name is Sorgatani Beki Niece by marriage, legend by reputation. She's not beautiful in the fragile sense. She's strategic, sharp-eyed, and currently reviewing a letter from a Chinese merchant, offering her exclusive rights to a paper. Dye that changes color with heat. She'll accept, but not because of the dye. She'll accept because the merchant is in love with her, and she knows it. Their brief affair, clandestine, passionate, probably a little awkward, sparked a trade deal that redirected the flow of Chinese lacquerware through her son's territory. That son? Kublai Khan. Yes, that Kublai. Turns out the path to empire sometimes runs straight through maternal flirtation and a well-placed shipment of exotic inks. Historians still argue whether these affairs were truly romantic or purely political. The truth is likely both. Mongol. Women were allowed an unusual degree of sexual and political autonomy. Widows could remarry. Daughters could inherit. Lovers could be kept quietly as long as the horses didn't mind. In one preserved folktale, a woman named Belorma ran a small textile operation near the Altai Mountains. She had 3 lovers, each from a different territory, and used pillow talk to coordinate the timing of caravans, ensuring that her goods arrived first at every regional fair. It worked, until one lover caught wind of the scheme and rerouted her silk delivery through a swamp. Petty? Yes, but effective. And here's your curious detail for tonight. Mongol nobles often used embroidered sashes to signify affection or private contracts. A red sash meant shared secrets. A blue one meant shared bed. A gold one? That was reserved for alliances so intimate they didn't require ink. One surviving sash, now in a museum in Ulaanbaatar, is stitched with 2 names and a tiny diagram of a horse tied to a yurt postal code. Scholars suspect for "you belong here," or maybe just "come back soon, bring wine." Even Marco Polo noted the sensual politics of the Mongol courts. In his travels, he observed the gifting of women to foreign envoys, not as objects, but as deliberate diplomatic gestures. These women weren't mere gifts. They were trained in language, dance, and negotiation. They gathered information, charmed secrets from their guests, and occasionally altered trade decisions with a touch to the arm and a well-timed sigh. One such woman, known only as Tumman, is credited with brokering a silk and stone exchange between Tibet and Samarkand simply by getting 2 feuding envoys very drunk and very jealous of her affections. Foucault would probably call this a soft mechanism of power, but you might just call it genius with cleavage, even when love wasn't involved. Seduction lingered in the air like smoke. Mongol men wrote poems to their absent wives, some painfully sincere, others suspiciously similar. One man, it said, sent the exact same love poem to 4 different women across the empire. All 4 replied with identical lines of sarcastic poetry, and then, astonishingly, banded together to form a joint trading syndicate that outperformed his own caravan business. Petty? Again. Brilliant? Absolutely. As you stand on a windswept ridge, yurts clustered like clouds on the plain below, you begin to grasp the full extent of the empire's invisible scaffolding. Not built of walls or even roads, but of relationships. A lover's favor could smooth a tax route. A night in someone's arms might unlock the gates to a new port. And behind every saddlebag stuffed with trade goods, there might be a letter, scented with goat milk soap and regret. This was seduction as infrastructure, lust as logistics. So R.H.A.G. Tani, somewhere in her palace of felt and firelight, finishes her letter with a final stroke of ink and smiles faintly. She knows the merchant will return, not because he has to, but because she made him want to. And when he does, he'll bring her the dye, but more importantly, he'll bring news. Who's trading with whom? Which routes are blocked? Which alliances are breaking? And she listen, nod, and then lace her boots, because the woman who rules the trade winds wears no crown. Just earrings, patience, and very good spies. By now, you've wandered so far that the Silk Road no longer feels like a path. It feels like a memory stitched across half the world, frayed at the edges, perfumed with longing. The caravan bells have quieted, the laughter of merchants echoes. Only in your mind, And the love letters once passed in secret now sleep in museums or rot beneath sand. But threads remain. You arrive at a small village on the western edge of what was once the great trade network, where the wind carries the scent of old parchment and lavender. An elderly woman sits beneath a fig tree, slowly embroidering a tapestry. The pattern, not flowers or birds, but names, dozens of them. Names no one else remembers. She says they were passed down from her grandmother, who heard them from her mother, who heard them from a woman who once served tea to a Venetian merchant with a crooked smile and a secret agenda. Some of the names are lovers, others are spies. One, she swears, was a queen disguised as a perfume girl. And whether any of it's true doesn't really matter, because the stories are what survive. You follow her finger to a section of the tapestry woven in faded blues and golds. There, stitched in looping thread, is the word Salai. No one knows who she was, but legend says she embroidered her name into every robe she ever wore, and one of those robes ended up in a royal Persian wedding, carried by accident, or maybe on purpose by a merchant who loved her more than profit. Some scholars say she never existed. Others claim to have found one of her robes in a tomb near Tashkent. But the real truth? She existed the moment someone whispered her name beside a fire, and someone else listened. And here's your final curious detail. In certain rare pieces of Silk Road silk under the embroidery, between the layers, textile historians have discovered tiny inscriptions. Sometimes just initials. Sometimes full phrases like, "He touched my hand," or "Return to the orchard." These weren't visible on the outside. They were private, sewn where only the wearer or the maker would know. A hidden language of desire, heartbreak, hope. Scholars still debate the purpose messages for future lovers. Warnings? Or just a way to hold on to something when everything else was always moving. Foucault would say the body was made into a site of meaning. You might say someone just needed to feel remembered. You pass through a forgotten town where the last remnants of a caravanserai crumble under ivy and moss. A single wall remains, faintly painted with figures in mid-embrace, arms looped around torsos, expressions blurred but unmistakably tender. Nearby, a slab of stone holds a line carved in an ancient dialect. The thread is not broken. It's easy to dismiss as romantic nonsense, until you remember that every item traded, every route opened, every tax adjusted, was done by people in love. Or lust, or grief, or revenge. The Silk Road didn't run on silver and camels. It ran on the letters tucked into saddlebags, the glances across market stalls, the vows made between strangers who knew they'd never see each other again, but still chose to share a meal. A night, a name. Even now, as the world blurs into glowing screens and shipping containers, we still echo them. We still send gifts wrapped in meaning. We still fall for people we shouldn't, say things we only half mean, and trade secrets and metaphors. The Silk Road might be gone, but its whispers haven't stopped. They live in your grandmother's earrings, in the smell of saffron when you open the spice jar, in the way someone's eyes linger too long before they look away. Lust, longing, and logistics, they never really change. You return to the tapestry. The woman has finished a new name, Noura. She doesn't explain who Noura was. Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe she just liked the way the letters curved. Or maybe, deep down, she remembers a story about a girl who once danced for a Mongol prince and convinced him to forgive a city. A story her mother told her in whispers, late at night, when the only light came from the moon and the soft flicker of an oil lamp. And as the stars rise over the hills, and the last of the tea cools beside your hand, you let the silence settle. You feel the weight of every secret kiss, every embroidered code, every traded sigh. You understand finally that the Silk Road was never just a route. It was a great human ache braided across centuries. A living diary inked in touch, traded in glances, and signed in silence. Now if you listen closely, you might still hear them, the voices of lovers long dead, Still negotiating in the dark, still waiting at the border for someone to choose them over gold dot, and now, take a breath. Let the images fade, the lantern lit. Markets, the trembling scrolls, the dusty perfume of forgotten robes. Let your body sink gently into stillness, like silk settling on quiet stone. The journey is behind you now. No more merchants. No more whispers. Just the hum of night air and the soft comfort of sleep pulling you inward. You're safe. You're home. And somewhere, across time, a story you didn't know you needed has curled into your dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.